right, welcome everyone. Can you hear me? Is this working? Welcome everyone, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank you and thank our presenters today. This is an incredibly important topic for us here at the law school, but also something that we've been involved in since actually Professor Bernard helped put together something with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Congressman Cummings, where we were able to have people come in from the community and talk about the DOJ report. And this is just a natural progression of that, and I think we're excited about the opportunities that you will have, and as well as faculty, but I know that Professor Bernard and others have been working on having opportunities for those of you who want to engage in this process to continue to engage, and I think we hope that the law school as community members will be able to continue to be a positive force in how all of this moves forward. So I just really wanted to take a moment to welcome you all, to thank Professor Bernard for putting this together. It's Denise, right? Who is an alum and had mentioned that she had then Professor Andre Davis as her evidence professor. So excited to have him back as well. And for those of you who know Judge Davis, I guess we don't call you Judge Davis anymore. So the Solicitor Davis, who did the amazing thing of stepping down from the Court of Appeals to be the city solicitor. And when people asked him, sort of, are you crazy or why did you want to do this? He really wanted to give back to his city and be a really central part of doing that. So we welcome him back as well. And I will now turn it over to Professor Bernard.
All right. Thank you. Good afternoon. It's officially 2 minutes after 12, so a good afternoon to you all. So no one really can overstate the importance of these times in which we find ourselves, particularly as they relate to policing in Baltimore. We are living in a monumental moment, one that will shape and define the future of policing in the city. And so we're fortunate to have with us today two leaders in Baltimore who have central roles in this process moving forward, a process that aims to transform policing and police-community relations in Baltimore, and both are actually alums of our law school. So Solicitor Andre Davis, I was about to say judge, but now I will say Solicitor Andre Davis is, of course, Baltimore City Solicitor, and so he quite literally is Baltimore's lawyer. He assumed this position on September 1st after having served as a federal judge for over 20 years, first with the U.S. District Court of Maryland and then with the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And Denise Duval is a member of the Community Oversight Task Force, and she will explain what that really entails. But this task force was formed as a requirement of the consent decree, and the task force members will recommend reforms to the current system of civilian oversight of the BPD. And Ms. Duval has long been of service to Baltimore. She specialized in housing and community development law at the Community Law Center. She actually taught in the Community Development Clinic here at our law school as part of our clinical law program, and also taught in a similar clinic at UB's law school. And she served as the Deputy Housing Commissioner for Baltimore's Department of Housing and Community Development. So Solicitor Davis and Ms. Duval will talk about their roles in Baltimore at this time. They will share obstacles and opportunities for transforming Baltimore's police department, and they will share some thoughts about how you as law students can and should be engaged in these efforts rather than moving forward. Just to put it succinctly, there will be some internship opportunities with the city's law department and with the Community Oversight Task Force to help do this important work. Before they speak, though, I want to set some context, if you will, for this discussion. So it took Freddie Gray's death in April 2015 for the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice to come to the city to thoroughly investigate Baltimore's police department. And on August 10, 2016...
Michael, can you talk closer to the mic?
Sure. Can you guys hear me now in the back? Okay, I'll hunch over for this microphone. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. So if I fall, don't, we know blame those folks in the back. So on August 10, 2016, The DOJ concluded that there was reasonable cause to believe that the BPD engages in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the Constitution and federal law. So in a nutshell, the DOJ concluded that the BPD, as a matter of institutional culture, violates the constitutional rights, the dignity and humanity of Baltimore's black men, women, and children. The DOJ found, quote, that racially disparate impact is present at every stage of BPD's enforcement actions. It also found that the BPD engages in gender-biased policing by routinely failing to adequately investigate and actually affirmatively disregarding reports of sexual assault. And the report lays out obstacles, if you will, of interacting with individuals with disabilities, individuals with mental health issues, and our young folks here in Baltimore. It lays out lack of training, outdated technology, lack of accountability within the department, and inadequate civilian oversight. And these findings confirmed what many Baltimore residents have been screaming about and crying about for decades. These findings were really not a big reveal to the too many individuals and families who have long suffered in Baltimore. The report did not tell them anything that they did not know. So the looming questions are this: how can we maximize this moment? How can we work collectively to ensure that the BPD in its entirety approaches all people and all communities in Baltimore with the respect, the knowledge, and the appreciation of humanity that's necessary to develop the relationships that are necessary to serve and protect Baltimore? So the first step is Baltimore's consent decree. And this decree really is an alternative to litigation. It's essentially a way to settle a lawsuit. A party agrees to take specific action. And Judge James Bedard ended and approved this decree on April 7th of this year. And the decree, just to really summarize it very, very broadly, requires the Community Oversight Task Force that Ms. Duval will talk about. It requires community policing and community engagement in policing. It requires the BPD to protect the Fourth and First Amendment rights of all residents. It requires impartial policing. It requires that officers be trained to interact with individuals with disabilities, with individuals who are in crisis, and with youth. It requires officers to be trained and to implement a trauma-informed, victim-centered approach to sexual assault victims. It also requires new policies related to supervision, officer investigations, and recruitment and hiring. And 1 month ago, Judge Bedard approved Ken Thompson as the independent monitor of the consent decree. And Mr. Thompson is a native Baltimorean, he's a partner at Venable, and he is yet another alum of our law school. And as monitor, Mr. Thompson is charged with ensuring that the parties take the steps necessary to fulfill the decree, right, and also provide technical support to the parties to enable them to do so. He's also charged with reporting to the court. So, community voice and community participation has been central to all steps of this process, from the DOJ investigation to the drafting of the consent decree and to giving input to the 24 or so groups that applied to be the monitoring team. It is important that their voices remain central to this process moving forward. So, some other chief questions, if you will. How will this decree be operationalized? What are the obstacles and the opportunities? And how can we be of service to this process moving forward? So this will be the first of many conversations around this process moving forward, but we wanted to start with these two great people today. So Ms. Duval, I believe you're speaking first, or is it this list? Okay.
Thank you. I tell you, it does me so much good to come into this building. It's always so great to come back to the law school. Professor Bernard has asked us to talk for less than 15 minutes about each of our topics. I'm going to talk about the consent decree and the role of the law department, and we want to leave as much time as possible for questions and dialogue. Let me start by saying that for me it's really personal. I haven't shared this very broadly, but on the day of the uprising, I was typically at home in my jammies, working on some opinion. As an appellate court judge, I had the luxury of working from home a lot on my laptop. I'm one of those strange 65-year-old plus who actually can read on a laptop and enjoys working on a laptop. And what I want you to try to grasp for me as the uprising emerged was I'm sitting there and I'm watching on television, and there are helicopter shots and there's shots from the street level, every channel on the TV, including CNN and MSNBC, of course, converged on Baltimore. And what I want to share is that as a 16-year-old, I actually bust dishes at Mondawmin Mall, which is where the uprising occurred. And my sister, although I didn't, my sister attended Douglas High School, which was the high school that the kids came out of across the street from Mondawmin Mall. To see all of that happen over those hours that afternoon, for me, was like watching a family member succumb to a bad illness. I hope you will indulge me for that somewhat over-dramatized reaction to what I observed that April day 2 years ago. But the impact on me was enormous. I get emotional now just talking about it, because I'm not just from Baltimore, I'm really of Baltimore in a very profound way. So I say all of that to say this work that I'm embarking on as the city solicitor, as I say, is very personal to me, has deep meaning to me in ways that that perhaps as a lawyer I should try to avoid. But the truth of the matter, it is personal for me. I, over 30 years as a judge, was a regular critic of Baltimore City Police. Sometimes very loudly, sometimes on the front page of the Baltimore Sun, or the Afro, or WEAA, or WYPR. I was out there, I was loud, I was vociferous. I called police officers liars, and I screamed out for improvement over the entirety of my 30-year judicial career. So when out of the blue, as a senior federal appellate judge, someone reached out to me on behalf of then candidate Kathy Pugh to become the city solicitor for Baltimore City at a time when the Department of Justice had completed its work and was working to fashion its findings and looking toward the possibility of a consent decree. When I was contacted to see if I would consider it, my first reaction was, you got to be out of your mind. I love what I'm doing. I think I'm having an impact. But then I thought about it, and after saying no to the mayor, then the candidate mayor, candidate Pugh, twice, I finally said yes. So I regard it as something of what I refer to whimsically as a reverse Sobolov. Those of you who don't know should know that the most distinguished, I think it's true to say, the most distinguished graduate of this incredible law school is the great Simon Sobolov, whose photograph is somewhere here in the building, I know, who became, after graduating, among other things, the Solicitor General of the United States and a judge, and then the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. I say I do a reverse Sobolov because Judge Sobolov was the city solicitor for Baltimore City before he went on to those other distinguished offices, and I'm doing it the other way. But I'm delighted to be back in the city solicitor's office as a judge graduate of the University of Maryland School of Law. By the way, one of, if not the most preeminent opinions ever fashioned by Judge Sobolov during his tenure on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit was a case called Veeney versus Warden, which was a 2254 post-conviction challenge to, actually it was a 1983 action connected to a post-conviction proceeding in which the Baltimore City Police conducted dragnet searches over the Christmas holidays in 1964 in East Baltimore, looking for a couple of cop killers. And Judge Sobeloff wrote a very moving opinion about how important the rule of law is, even in the most trying of times. And its echoes, of course, ring in our ears today, as we do indeed live in trying times. So the prior administration invited into Baltimore, in consequence of the Freddie Gray circumstances, invited into Baltimore the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to do a top-to-bottom assessment of the Baltimore City Police Department. Long overdue, and nobody was surprised when the findings came out that the Baltimore City Police Department needed reform from top to bottom. Now that's not to say, and it's important in my role as a lawyer to remind you, that the city itself and the police department do not agree with all of the findings returned by the Department of Justice. There are indeed disputes of material fact over certain aspects of what the Department of Justice found. But the truth of the matter is the Baltimore City Police Department is grievously broken. Grievously broken. Lacking in technology, lacking in strong leadership, lacking in strong training protocols, and lacking in fundamental regard for the human dignity of the people they police. This was the situation facing the Baltimore City Police Department in the spring of 2015. These conditions didn't come about overnight. They were a long time coming, and they were obvious to anyone who would look closely enough to see them. I should mention, Baltimore City Police has a very curious history. Baltimore has a very curious history. The Baltimore City Police Department is a state agency. It's really a weird legal history. You can find lots of information about it. The commissioner of the Baltimore City Police is a state official, although there hasn't been a she yet, is appointed and can be removed by the mayor. The taxpayers of Baltimore City are on the hook to fund the vast majority of the Baltimore City Police operations, but it's a state agency. So there's a lot of weird legal entanglements of a historical and contemporary character that make maintaining the Baltimore City Police Department as an upstanding, efficient, respectful agency of government very challenging. And that's what I undertook to do when I agreed to become, and then became on September 1st, the city solicitor for Baltimore City. So the Baltimore City Police Department is my client, as is the mayor and city council for Baltimore City. Being a lawyer doesn't mean you can't criticize your client. And I'm happy to criticize my client when it's appropriate for me to do so, and when it's apparent that criticism is warranted. So the consent decree is a court order. It's a court order. There is a case underlying the consent decree, United States of America versus the Mayor and City Council of Baltimore and the Baltimore City Police Department. It's a real case in federal court. You can look it up. Assigned to Judge James Berdar, now the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Maryland. And so one of the things I say to my clients, the police commissioner, the command staff, and others, is my job as your lawyer is to make sure you don't go before Judge Berdar on a contempt citation. Because the court order requires the City of Baltimore and its police department to reform itself, to improve its practices, And it's unique in a number of ways, But one way in which this consent decree, and there have been lots of others, of course, in Seattle, Cleveland, other cities, but Baltimore's is, I'm sure, the most comprehensive. When I say top to bottom, it really is a top to bottom imposition on the City of Baltimore to the tune of about $1.5 million a year for 5 years, just to hire the people whose job it is to report back to the court on the progress that we are making. Everything from transporting detainees to training of supervisors to training of rank and file, training of community people to be involved with the police department, use of force, stop and frisk, sexual assault, the mentally challenged, you name it. There's something in that consent decree that requires the police department for Baltimore City to change its practices. And as I say, my job as the city's lawyer is to make sure my clients live up to their obligations under that consent decree. It's going to be really tough. It's going to be really, really tough. One of the reasons it's going to be really, really tough is the Fraternal Order of Police. Baltimore is a union town, has long been and proudly remains a union town. My job after my freshman year at college, when I came back to Baltimore from Philadelphia, I got a job in the Bethlehem Steel Mill out in Baltimore County. I made more money than I ever imagined I could ever make. Working doubles in the coke factory ovens in Bethlehem Steel. And I had to become a union member to do that. So Baltimore is a union member. Every man in my family was a member of the union. But the Fraternal Order of Police has Baltimore, and I've said this publicly, I'm not speaking out of school, has Baltimore and the Baltimore City Police Department in a chokehold. For reasons I won't go into over the years, the city, unfortunately, has not been, I'll put it this way, has not retained some of the managerial prerogatives related to scheduling and some other issues that makes it now more difficult than perhaps it should be for us to bring the rank and file police department members into compliance with what's expected of the consent decree. But we're going to do it. We're going to do it. In this regard, failure is not an option for me, for Mayor Pugh, or for Baltimore City, or for you. Those of you who live in the city, who visit the city, who care about the city, who go to school in the city, all of us need to contribute in the way that we can to bring about the reforms. I testified before the Legislative Black Caucus several weeks ago down in Annapolis, and one of the delegates said to me, Solicitor Davis, I have a question for you. If a motorist in Baltimore City is pulled over by a police officer, does that motorist have the right to ask the officer why she was stopped? And my immediate reaction to the delegate's question was, well, let me answer this way. That motorist shouldn't have to ask, because best practices of community policing, which is what we're aiming for in this city, and what I think the consent decree requires, is that the officer approach the motorist, and as a part of asking for registration, insurance, and driver's license information, advise the motorist why she was stopped. Your taillight is out, or you ran a stop sign, or whatever it is. Motorist, of course, doesn't have to agree with the officer. Probably won't agree with the officer. But best practices is what we're going after. Constitutional best practice. Some of you may have seen the article in the paper over the weekend about how gun seizures are down in the city. I don't know if those statistics are accurate or not, but you know, if constitutional policing means you seize fewer guns, then so be it. So be it. We can reduce crime, we can reduce violence, we can keep the community safe, and we can do all those things in a model of constitutional best practice community policing. I believe that in my heart of hearts. I'm going to work to achieve it every day throughout my time as a city solicitor, and I dare say even after and when, if it comes, when it comes, I leave the office. Because I'm committed to the city. I believe the city deserves better than it's gotten, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Let me end on this note. There are really great opportunities out there in connection with the consent decree and the monitoring process for legal internships and externships. I hope those of you who are students will take full advantage of the opportunity that this moment in history affords you to really become engaged in your community, to develop your legal skills, and including your skills of legal analysis, and to learn an awful lot about an important area of the law. Beyond that, as I've said to Professor Pinard, the Baltimore City Law Department has opportunities for internships that I hope you all will take full advantage of. I really will be very disappointed if, I really mean this, if every semester, including the summer, we don't have at least a couple of University of Maryland Law School students interning in my office, not just on the police consent decree matter and police reform, but in any number of areas that the Baltimore Law Department covers. Remember, we do everything from representing the police to land use, zoning, contracting, and general litigation. Everything from accidents with garbage trucks to trip and falls, and we need all the help we can get. So take advantage of the opportunity you have 5 blocks east of here to spend 10 to 15 hours a week learning from some of the best lawyers in the state, and I'll appreciate your assistance. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Hey, this microphone was made for me. Nice and short. So I'm Denise Duval, and as you heard, I was once sitting in your seats, and Judge Davis was my criminal procedure professor. Long time ago, it was actually 30 years ago, and Judge Davis quickly became one of my legal heroes. So it's really an honor to be with him, working on these issues, and just to be with him today back at the law school. He really taught me everything I know about constitutional policing and unconstitutional policing. And like I said, that was 30 years ago, and here we still are talking about unconstitutional policing. But I am not discouraged. I am very, very hopeful. I'm a lover of Baltimore. I've lived here for 30 years since I came here for law school. And I know how great this city is, and I know how great the community leaders are in the city, and the people of Baltimore. And I think I'm more hopeful than ever that we can address these issues because Judge Davis is the city solicitor, and we have a consent decree. Having a consent decree is an amazing thing. We may be the last city in America to have a consent decree, given what's happening in Washington. And because many other cities have had consent decrees, we get to learn from them and do it better than anyone else has done it. And I really think that Baltimore can. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Community Oversight Task Force. I know if you're in Professor Pinard's class, you read the DOJ report and the consent decree. But if for those of you who haven't, I'll just walk you through a little bit of it. So let me start by reading you a quote from a Court of Appeals decision in Maryland State Police versus Dashiell, which is an important case. In a dissent, the case did not go the way it should have, but in a dissent, the judge says, honoring the public's right to know how law enforcement agencies respond to misconduct, especially misconduct that arises out of contact with the public, is vital to maintaining the public's trust in law enforcement. In other words, to paraphrase Justice Louis Brandeis, transparency is the best remedy. So that kind of and then if you look at the DOJ report, which honestly, if you're a law student in the United States of America, or certainly in Baltimore, you should read. You should have this on your bedside table and read the DOJ report, even if you're not in Professor Bernard's class. It is so important to read that report, to know what has happened in Baltimore City and the problems that are facing us that we need to solve. So the DOJ report concludes that current civilian oversight mechanisms are inadequate and ineffective and almost entirely shielded from public view. Almost entirely shielded from public view. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the consent decree, as Judge Davis mentioned, is a court order, and it requires that this group called the Civilian Oversight Task Force be established. The mayor has established the Civilian Oversight Task Force, and it consists of 9 community members. I'm one of them. There's 8 other amazing people on this group, and our meetings are public. I'm going to invite you to our meetings at the end. The consent decree mandates that we exist, and it mandates that we review the current civilian oversight system in Baltimore, that we identify impediments, that we consider oversight models in other cities or other countries, and that we recommend changes and improvements. And it's really broad. As Judge Davis knows, my favorite section of our mandate is this catch-all that's going to allow us to basically recommend anything we want to. It says we have to look at civilian review, we have to try to fix that system, but we also can recommend any changes that should be made to the Baltimore Police Department's policing strategies that will increase cooperation between the Baltimore Police Department and the community it serves. Well, I think that's a pretty broad mandate to recommend changes that will result in the community trusting the police, because that's the ultimate goal. So that's our mandate. Like I said, we've been established. We are a public body appointed by the mayor, so all of our meetings are public. Anyone can come to our meetings. We put our minutes to our meetings. So if you go to the city website and look up Community Oversight Task Force, you'll see our meeting schedule, you'll see our minutes from past meetings, you'll see what we're up to. But basically what we're doing is we have 3 subcommittees formed. One is looking at the current city civilian review board process. The other, another subcommittee is looking at national models for reform, and the third subcommittee is organizing a series of 9 community forums around the city so that we can get input from the citizens about what they think the reforms should be. And so we're busy at work on that, and I am so excited to see so many people come to this forum, because I have spoken with Professor Bernard, but the task force is looking for help, and law students are who we need. So let me just tell you a little bit about the citizen review process in Baltimore City. So the current system has been in place since 1999. And what happens right now if a citizen makes a complaint about police misconduct, the police department does their own internal investigation in their internal affairs division, does their own internal investigation, and the civilian review board does a concurrent investigation into whether that misconduct happened, and and makes recommendations if they sustain the allegations. So the current system is quite limited, and partly because in 1999, when that law was passed, it went through a lot of sausage making in the process of passing that law, and the FOP and lots of other things came into play in terms of lobbying, as well as different legal restrictions
Denise,
that
I didn't
existed.
define FOP, and we shouldn't assume that.
Oh, I'm
everybody
sorry,
knows.
yeah, the Fraternal Order of Police. The Fraternal Order of Police, that's the union for the police in Baltimore. And so, not to bore you with all the details, but I'm hoping that someone would love to work with me on this, but there's lots of ways that that Civilian Review Board does not have much authority. So what happens is there's these concurrent investigations. The State Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which is a state law, really curtails the ability of the Civilian Review Board to do civilian review, because it limits who can do an investigation to a sworn law enforcement officer. So all the systems that are currently in place right now in Baltimore have police policing police. Okay, and so that is problematic from a citizen perspective. Now, the Civilian Review Board does have 9 citizen members, 1 from each police district, but they cannot be the investigator. They have to have a law enforcement officer do the investigation of the misconduct. Then that person comes back, and they can subpoena. They have some subpoena power, but they don't have subpoena power to subpoena the officer who in question, the officer who a civilian is saying engaged in misconduct. So that's a problem. And so then these concurrent investigations happen. They come back to the Civilian Review Board. The Review Board, this 9-member panel, makes a recommendation about what the police commissioner should do in response. Then they make their recommendation to the police commissioner. The police commissioner gets to do whatever he wants with the recommendation. He can follow it, he can totally ignore it, and he never has to tell the citizens or even the Civilian Review Board what he chose to do. And so if you're a citizen in Baltimore City and you make a police misconduct complaint, the only way you can at the moment, you will never find out what happened with that complaint. And that's not much transparency from the community's perspective. Now, there's lots of legal reasons why this is the case, and challenges. So, and the other thing that I found really, well, many things that I've been learning are quite astonishing, but another thing that can happen, and this is not in law, this is in the collective bargaining agreement of the police department, which also really affects this stuff, that if the Civilian Review Board had sustained a allegation of police misconduct and the police officer something happened to him, like maybe something internally happened to him in the police department, after 3 years, he can, or she can, expunge that from their internal personnel police department record. And that's a problem, because if you are trying to engage in civilian oversight and see which officers have patterns of bad behavior, you are not going to get the whole history of an officer, because he or she could basically go through an internal process to take complaints out of their file. And so, I mean, so that's a little thing, but it's a big thing, and they all add up to a system of civilian oversight that's very, very weak. And we have a heavy lift, as Judge Davis says. The whole consent decree is a heavy lift, but so is civilian oversight. It's a heavy lift because there's a lot of impediments. So challenges legally. There's state law, there's public local law, there's the LEOBR, which I said before, I mean, honestly, that's probably our biggest obstacle at this point, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which was a law that was passed in 1974. There's the collective bargaining agreement, and there is, honestly, the political will to make this stuff happen. So lots of cities have seen unrest. Lots of cities have done the kind of work that we're doing, and sometimes these reports or recommendations, lists of things that, reforms that need to happen, sometimes they don't get implemented. They sit on a shelf, and then something else happens, and we say, why didn't that change happen then? Okay, so like I said, I'm hopeful though, not trying to depress you, I'm hopeful. We are in Baltimore. We have a great city of wonderful citizens. We have Judge Davis as the city solicitor. We have a consent decree. We are going to make recommendations that we work really hard to implement, and they have to be implemented. Everyone, the citizens have to demand it, and quite honestly, you guys have to make it happen. That's why I'm really glad you're here, because this is a marathon. In fact, it's like a marathon relay, okay? So 30 years we've been talking about this. You guys are next. You're next. We're passing the baton to you. Whatever happens with the consent decree in the next 5 years, you're going to be lawyers. You have to make it happen. You have to implement it. And it's super exciting to be a lawyer right now, I think. And to be like, this is so, like for me, this is so awesome to be able to be on the Community Oversight Task Force and try to use my legal skills and my experience in the community in Baltimore to make change happen. It's the best part of being a lawyer. So really would be so excited to have you guys help us. Like I said, we need everyone's help. I think this is the civil rights issue of our time, of your generation. This problem has got to be solved. We must have constitutional policing. We must have a constitutional society. So we need everyone to help with that. Our next Community Oversight Task Force meeting is this Thursday night. We go all over the city for our meetings, but this Thursday it's going to be at 1510 West Lafayette Avenue, which is the community center out in West Baltimore. You're welcome to come. It's from 5 to 7. You can see what we're up to, and then certainly talk to Professor Bernard if you want to help. We need help doing all the things I outlined. So looking at the local laws and how they're working or not working, looking at the national models, which is the part that is pretty exciting. Is the part that the subcommittee that I'm working on is actually looking at the national models and figuring out what would work in Baltimore. That is legal research, research and also other kinds of research, but talking to people in other cities about what's happening and what's working and what's not. Because other cities have implemented things, and again, Baltimore gets to be the beneficiary of this information. Like, they've implemented things and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We get the benefit of that, and we can try to do it right or better or what's best for Baltimore. So again, we have lots of work that we'd love for you to engage with us on, and I look forward to having you continue this struggle with us. Thank you.
Very tight space. So we wanted to open this up to any questions we hope that you have. I have been reminded to let everyone know that we are being recorded. So something we're supposed to say, and I forgot to say that at the outset. So folks with questions about what you've heard, about ways to get involved, just about the process altogether, or just your thoughts, be appreciated.
I was going to ask, in terms of the task force, how do you guys center your meetings? Are there topics for each meeting? And then also in terms of making recommendations, do you guys have a timeline of when you hope to get things out? Or kind of, obviously this is a massive thing that you're tackling, so how are you doing it?
Right.
Was everyone able to hear the question? Okay.
So actually, the consent decree gives us a timeline. We have to make our recommendations in 11 months. And a couple of those months have gone by already. So our initial report is due in March of 2018. And so we, at our meetings, we report out about our subcommittee work and then, talk about new business. The agendas are on the website too. So you can see what the agenda is. Sometimes, because we go to different communities for the meetings, sometimes our host will talk about what they do or what they're interested in. And then at the end of the meetings, there's time for public to interact with the task force. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Hi. So the consent decree specifically states that it's not intended for third-party use to create liability by or against the city and the Baltimore Police Department. Does this mean that this legal document can't be used in a court of law to, for example, prosecute individual officers' behavior, or in any other form in a court of law?
If I can rephrase your query a little bit, the point is the consent decree, like many similar and documents, includes a disclaimer that it is not intended to create third-party rights. And so that, I wasn't around when it was negotiated, of course, by the way, but the point that provision is trying to achieve is that a member of the public or anybody else can't use the findings or the consent decree itself, more particularly, as a basis for a lawsuit against the city. Now, that said, we've already been sued more than 50 times since the consent decree was executed, and quite a few of those lawsuits quote from the Justice Department findings and from the consent decree. So people will try to use the consent decree to prove claims of excessive force and unconstitutional policing, notwithstanding that language. But yeah, it's not intended to provide a cause of action for anybody.
I saw some hands up over here. Yes.
So, Solicitor Davis, you mentioned that the Fraternal Order of the Police presents a little bit of a challenge to moving forward with the changes. Do you see a relationship being established or some way to create a relationship with them to help push changes forward?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful that going forward, the relationship between the Fraternal Order of Police and the police department and the city will improve. Let me say a couple things about that. Policing is a tough job. Some might even say, not incorrectly, particularly in a place like Baltimore City or any urban center with lots of structural poverty and discrimination and historical and contemporaneous discrimination, it's an impossible job. But it's a job that we need people to assume, we need them to be good at it, and we should pay them well to do it, frankly. I mean, let's face it, the two highest paid professions in our society today should be teachers and police officers. But that's not the world we live in. We live in the world we live in. And so nobody begrudges, I don't certainly, and I think few begrudge police officers having protection. They are vulnerable, both physically vulnerable as they go about their jobs, and they are vulnerable in other ways. It's the easiest thing in the world to do, notwithstanding what Denise correctly pointed out are certain deficiencies, is to make a complaint against the police officer. Nobody wants to be stopped for driving too fast or driving too slow or making an illegal left turn. It's not a happy situation. So the criticism that I direct, and that I think people of good faith direct at the Fraternal Order of Police, is the rather, frankly, extreme positions they sometimes take in the face of a crying need for a different way to do things. And so right now we're involved in this struggle over scheduling. And so there are other struggles similar to that we hope that the union for the police department will get on board with the city and work more cooperatively. Right now it's an adversarial relationship, and the relationship between management and labor in a classic, labor and employment sense doesn't have to be adversarial, and I'm hoping that we can take some of the adversarialness out of the relationship. If you haven't heard of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, you ought to take a look at it. It's a state statute, and Maryland's Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights and the attendant regulations and procedures that have grown up around the Maryland statute are extreme. They are truly extreme. As Denise pointed out, under the guise of police officer discipline being internal personnel matters, there's this incredible secrecy surrounding so much of what happens in the disciplinary process involving police officers, and that is inimical to public trust in the police department, and thus contrary to the public interest, in my view. So we need to strip away some of the secrecy and lack of transparency in the process of disciplining police officers, which I think will lead to greater accountability, not just on the part of police officers, but on the part of police leadership and, frankly, city leadership. So that's what I'm hoping for. It's a long-winded answer to your question, I'm afraid. But unions justifiably fight for their membership, and the FOP has been very successful up until now, and so we'll see where it goes from here.
Your hand was in the back.
Yes, I had a question in regards to the Civilian Review Board and the task force. And from my limited reading, I understand the Civilian Review Board has had several vacancies. How is the task force different from the Civilian Review Board, and is there steps in place to go forward to ensure there's no vacancies for the sector? Sorry, it's a two-part question.
Yes, thank you. So it's a great question because it all goes back to this trust issue, right? So if we're trying to create trust between the police and the citizens, it's one thing that has happened historically or pretty recently. The Civilian Review Board law has been in place since 1999. But recently, post Freddie Gray, it's been hard to get citizens to serve on in those 9 civilian positions on the Civilian Review Board, because I believe it's because the board lacks power to really do anything about citizen complaints, and it's hard to get citizens to believe in the process enough to engage in it. And so, it's a broken system. That's one challenge, although my understanding is that the mayor there are people sort of getting vetted right now to fill the vacant positions on the Civilian Review Board. The task force is completely separate. We are looking at the process and recommending changes for the process. We might recommend reforms that just tweak the Civilian Review Board, or we may say the system's so broken we kind of need to start over, or we need to have a comprehensive system that looks like Y instead of X. You know what I mean? So we are just looking at it. We aren't hearing cases, okay? And just so you know, they get about 10 complaints. I think they said, I think they get about 150 complaints per year currently. That's how many cases are coming through their system. We think there's a lot more out there. One of the other things, this is the weeds, of course, but one of the other things is that they can only review 4 different sets of misconduct allegations, and they're pretty limited. So our recommendations may include opening that up to them reviewing lots more kinds of complaints, and their volume would go up.
Denise is being polite. The system in the city is broken, and nobody wants to waste their time engaged in an exercise that has no meaning. And so there's a lot of distrust in the city. There's a lot of feeling that, well, as she described it, you don't even find out what happened when you file a complaint. The members of the review board have little authority to do anything other than to write recommendations. And I think that's got to change. Much of the change will have to come from Annapolis, because it sort of all tracks back in an important way to this law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights. And so the thought really is that we've got to get, for example, one of the mayor's initiatives is to get civilian membership on the trial boards. The trial boards, where, of course, there are a couple going on right now. Well, there's one going on this week. One just ended last week. I'm sure most of you are aware, over at the University of Baltimore campus. But the secrecy, again, in the name of protecting personnel information of police officers, has to give way to the public interest needed for trust in and support for policing, has got to give way to greater transparency in that process. So it's got to happen at the trial board level, and it's got to happen at the civilian review board level. The tension has got to be worked out. And that's one of the things that I and the lawyers in my office are going to be working on going forward.
Your hand was up? I'm sorry.
Okay, can I just follow up? To give you a little example, like in Chicago, I think, I may be wrong about the city, but I think in Chicago, if the civilian review board makes a recommendation that the police commissioner doesn't follow, the police commissioner has to respond in writing with an explanation about why he or she didn't follow the recommendation. Nice idea, right?
So we have, well, Chicago has its own set of issues.
Yeah.
They won't get a consent decree. That's one of the jurisdictions you're talking about. So we have time. We have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so your hand has been up. So you asked the question.
Yeah, I'm a dual degree student. I'm working on an MSW as well as a JD, and like basically for this exact reason, this issue. And I think what social work brings to the table that sometimes law doesn't, maybe not directly at least, is like challenging systems and institutions and institutionalized racism and like how the police department embodies that. And I think that's the goal of taking the legal approach for sure. But what worries me when I read the consent decree and when I read the investigations, that like it has to be, we have to, for practicality, like approach this in a very technical way and like have benchmarks and, you know, like tasks that we are fulfilling. And I feel really optimistic, but I think the biggest thing that discourages me is the worry that we won't overhaul this institution, will continue to exist as like an oppressive thing. You know, I mean, like that, from my view, is why it exists the way it does. So I don't know. I haven't seen a ton of social work influence in the process yet, which is discouraging. I'm trying to make it